winter of 1994, a small religious archive in northern Italy received a sealed envelope from a rural parish priest. Inside the envelope was a handwritten report, a photograph of an old mirror, and a single line written in Latin across the top of the page. The translation read, "Some reflections are not meant for the living." The report described a disturbing case that had taken place months earlier in a quiet village church. A case that began with an ordinary household object and ended with an emergency exorcism authorized by the diocese. According to the priest's own statement, everything started when a young woman claimed that a mirror in her bedroom was showing her something that had not yet happened. Her own death. The woman's name was Elena Rossi. At the time, Elena was 26 years old and lived alone in a narrow stone house on the edge of the village. She worked as a school librarian and was known among neighbors as quiet, polite, and deeply private. Nothing in her background suggested instability. No criminal history. No record of mental illness. No known trauma. For most of her life, Elena's routine had been painfully ordinary. Until the mirror appeared. According to later testimony from Elena's sister, the mirror had originally belonged to their grandmother. After the grandmother passed away, several old household items were stored in the attic of the family home. Months later, Elena asked if she could take a few things to decorate her bedroom. Among them was a tall rectangular mirror framed in dark walnut wood. The frame was old but well preserved. Carved along its edges were faint patterns of vines and small crosses, though some of the carvings had been worn down with age. At first, the mirror seemed completely normal. Elena placed it against the wall beside her bed, where it reflected the narrow window across the room. Sunlight from the morning would fall directly onto the glass. For several days, nothing unusual happened. But then, according to Elena's written journal entries later discovered by investigators, something began to feel wrong. Not immediately frightening, just wrong. She described the sensation as the feeling that the reflection in the mirror did not always move at the same moment as the room itself. At first, she dismissed the thought as exhaustion. But the feeling returned again the following night. Elena wrote that while brushing her hair in front of the mirror, she briefly noticed something that made her pause. Her reflection had blinked, but she had not. The moment lasted less than a second. She stood still, staring at the glass. The reflection stared back, perfectly synchronized again. Elena later wrote that she laughed nervously at the time, assuming her eyes had simply played a trick on her. Still, that night, she covered the mirror with a blanket before going to sleep. The next morning she removed the blanket and examined the mirror carefully. There were no cracks, no distortions in the glass, just an ordinary reflection. For nearly a week, nothing else occurred. Until the dream. According to the priest's report, Elena began experiencing extremely vivid nightmares shortly after bringing the mirror into her room. The same dream repeated itself each night. She would wake up inside her bedroom, but everything around her felt heavier, quieter. The air seemed thick. In the dream, she would walk toward the mirror. And when she looked into it, she would see herself standing there. But her reflection looked different. Paler. Weaker, sometimes injured. On the third night, the reflection had dark bruises around the neck. On the fourth night, the reflection's eyes were closed, as if unconscious. And on the fifth night, the reflection was lying on the floor behind her, completely still. Elena woke up screaming. At first, she tried to ignore the dreams. But something deeply unsettling began happening after each one. The injuries she saw in the dream began appearing in reality. Not exactly the same, but close enough to terrify her. After the third dream, she woke with unexplained soreness around her throat. After the fourth dream, she noticed faint bruising along the side of her neck. Doctors later examined these marks and could not determine their origin. They appeared suddenly, without trauma. When Elena described the dreams to her sister, she was advised to simply remove the mirror from the room. That seemed like the obvious solution. But according to Elena, moving the mirror was when the real nightmare began. One evening she attempted to carry the mirror into the hallway closet. The mirror was heavier than expected, forcing her to lift it slowly. As she walked across the bedroom floor, something caught her attention. Her reflection in the mirror did not appear to be carrying the mirror. Instead, the reflection was standing still, watching her. Elena dropped the mirror immediately. The glass struck the floor with a violent sound, but it did not break. Witnesses later confirmed the mirror showed no sign of damage. Elena, however, refused to touch it again. From that point forward, she kept the mirror covered at all times. But covering the mirror did not stop the dreams. In fact, the dreams grew worse. And then the voices began. Elena first reported hearing faint whispers coming from the direction of the covered mirror late at night. At first, she assumed the sound came from outside the house. But the voices were not outside. They were behind the glass. According to her journal, the whispers sounded like distant conversations spoken through water. She could not understand the words clearly, but sometimes one phrase repeated over and over. A phrase that investigators later translated from her notes. Look again. The priest who later examined the case wrote that Elena became increasingly frightened during this period, but she was not yet convinced anything supernatural was occurring. Instead, she believed she might be experiencing severe stress. She sought medical help. A physician examined her over several visits. Blood tests were normal. Neurological tests showed no abnormal activity. Psychological evaluation found no sign of psychosis or hallucination disorder. Yet the whispers continued. And one night, something happened that forced Elena to look at the mirror again. According to the written report she gave the priest weeks later, Elena woke up suddenly around 3 a.m. The room was completely silent, but the blanket covering the mirror had fallen to the floor. Elena insisted she had secured it tightly before going to sleep. Now the mirror stood exposed in the dark. Moonlight from the window illuminated the glass just enough to see her reflection, sitting up in bed. For several seconds, she remained frozen, watching the mirror. Then the reflection slowly raised its hand. But Elena had not moved. Her reflection pointed toward the floor beside the bed. Confused and terrified, Elena looked down. There was nothing there. When she looked back at the mirror, the reflection was no longer pointing. Instead, it was staring directly at her. And then it collapsed. The reflection of Elena fell forward inside the mirror, striking the invisible floor beneath it. The body in the reflection did not move again. Elena screamed and ran from the room. Later that morning, she returned with her sister. But when they uncovered the mirror again, the reflection appeared completely normal. Just Elena standing there, alive, breathing. Yet Elena could not shake the image she had seen. Her reflection lying lifeless on the ground. And something else troubled her even more, because in the reflection behind the fallen body, there had been another figure standing in the room, watching her. A tall shadow that did not belong to anyone inside the house. For nearly 2 weeks, Elena refused to enter her bedroom. She slept on the living room couch and avoided the mirror entirely. But strange events continued to follow her. Small objects in the house moved without explanation. Lights flickered repeatedly during the night. And once, while washing dishes in the kitchen, Elena noticed her reflection in the window. Behind her stood the same tall shadow she had seen in the mirror. When she turned around, the room was empty. It was at this point that Elena contacted the parish church. The attending priest was Father Matteo Ricci. He later documented the entire encounter in a detailed report submitted to the diocesan archive. According to Father Matteo, Elena arrived at the church visibly exhausted. Her hands trembled while she described the events surrounding the mirror. At first, the priest approached the case cautiously. Many situations involving alleged hauntings or possessions often turned out to have psychological explanations. But one detail in Elena's story immediately concerned him: the dreams showing her own death. In the Catholic tradition, certain forms of spiritual oppression begin with visions of the victim's demise. Not literal prophecy, but psychological weakening. A way of instilling fear. Father Matteo decided to visit Elena's home personally. What he discovered there would later become one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the parish. When the priest entered the bedroom, the mirror was still standing against the wall, covered by a thick blanket. The room felt unusually cold, not freezing, but noticeably colder than the rest of the house. Father Matteo later wrote that he initially assumed the mirror itself was simply an old antique object causing Elena emotional distress. Still, he decided to perform a short blessing inside the room. As he recited the prayer, Elena stood quietly near the doorway. The priest approached the covered mirror and placed his hand gently on the frame. He then began the blessing of the object. Halfway through the prayer, the mirror knocked once against the wall behind it. A single loud tap. Father Matteo paused. The room fell silent again. Assuming it might have been the house settling, he continued the blessing. Then the mirror knocked again, this time harder. Elena gasped from the doorway. The priest pulled the blanket away, and for the first time he saw the mirror clearly. At first glance it appeared completely ordinary. But when Father Matteo looked into the reflection, he noticed something that caused him to stop speaking immediately. Because standing behind him in the mirror was a man that was not present in the room. The priest turned around immediately. The bedroom behind him was empty. Elena stood near the doorway exactly where she had been seconds earlier. No one else was inside the room. No sound came from the hallway. The house was silent. Father Matteo looked back at the mirror. The reflection behind him was now gone. Later, in his written report to the diocese, Father Matteo described the experience carefully, choosing his words with the precision expected in church documentation. He did not claim certainty. Instead, he wrote that the reflection had appeared momentarily inconsistent with the physical environment of the room. But Elena knew what he had seen. She had seen the priest's expression change, and she had heard him stop praying mid-sentence. Father Matteo finished the blessing without further interruption. When the prayer ended, he covered the mirror again with the blanket. He did not immediately tell Elena what he had seen. Instead, he asked a series of quiet questions. Had anyone else lived in the house before her? Had anyone died in the room? Had the mirror ever belonged to another family before her grandmother? Elena answered as best as she could. As far as she knew, the mirror had been in the family for decades. Her grandmother had purchased it from an estate sale sometime in the late 1950s. No records existed of where it came from before that. When the priest asked if she had ever tried to destroy it, Elena hesitated. She admitted she had considered it. But after the incident where the mirror fell without breaking, she had been too frightened to try again. Father Matteo stood quietly for several seconds. Then he asked Elena something that unsettled her even more. He asked if the mirror had ever shown her something that had not yet happened. Elena slowly nodded. She told him about the dreams, about seeing her own body lying motionless inside the reflection, about the bruises that had appeared on her neck afterward. For the first time since arriving at the house, the priest appeared deeply concerned. He asked Elena to describe the figure she had seen standing behind her reflection. She said the figure was tall. Its shape was human, but she could not see its face. It had been standing very still, almost like it was waiting. Father Matteo wrote later that Elena's description matched a pattern he had encountered once before in his early years of ministry. Not possession in the usual sense. Something quieter. Something patient. He asked Elena if she would allow the mirror to be taken to the church temporarily for examination. She agreed immediately. But moving the mirror proved more difficult than expected. The priest attempted to lift it from the wall. The frame was far heavier than its size suggested. Even with Elena helping, they struggled to carry it down the narrow staircase and into the back of Father Matteo's car. As they placed it inside the vehicle, Elena noticed something that made her stomach tighten. The mirror was angled slightly toward them. For a brief moment, she saw their reflections in the glass. Except there were 3 figures in the reflection. Her, the priest, and the tall shadow standing between them. Elena turned around quickly. The driveway behind them was empty. When she looked back into the mirror again, the 3rd figure had disappeared. The priest closed the car door without saying anything. The mirror was taken to the church that afternoon. According to the parish records, Father Matteo placed it in a small storage room adjacent to the sacristy where religious artifacts were sometimes kept before restoration. He locked the door. Only he possessed the key. Over the next several days, Father Matteo documented a series of strange occurrences inside the church building. The first happened that very night. At approximately 2 in the morning, The church caretaker reported hearing knocking sounds coming from the hallway outside the sacristy. Slow, rhythmic knocks against wood. When the caretaker opened the hallway door, the sound stopped. Nothing appeared out of place. But as he passed the storage room, he noticed something disturbing. Light was coming from underneath the door. The caretaker knew the room had no lights inside. Only a small window high on the wall, which could not produce that amount of brightness at night. Concerned, he knocked on the door. The light vanished immediately. The next morning, he informed Father Matteo. The priest unlocked the room and examined the mirror again. Nothing appeared unusual, but the surface of the glass felt extremely cold to the touch, far colder than the surrounding air. Over the next 3 nights, the knocking sounds continued. Sometimes a single knock, sometimes 3 in quick succession. The caretaker later insisted the sound seemed to come from inside the room itself, as if something were tapping against the mirror from the other side. On the 4th night, something even stranger occurred. Father Matteo had remained in the church late, reviewing Elena's written testimony. Shortly before midnight, while sitting in his office, he heard footsteps in the hallway. Slow footsteps, moving toward the storage room. Assuming it was the caretaker making his rounds, the priest stepped into the corridor. But the hallway was empty. The footsteps continued. Not in the hallway. Inside the locked room. Father Matteo approached the door slowly. He placed his hand against the wood. The footsteps stopped. Then came a soft sound from the other side. Glass. A finger dragging slowly across the surface of glass. The priest unlocked the door. The room was completely dark. Moonlight from the small window barely illuminated the mirror standing against the far wall. Nothing else moved. But as Father Matteo stepped closer, he noticed something on the glass. Condensation had formed across the entire surface. And on that condensation, someone had written a message using a finger. 3 words. Not in Italian, not in Latin, but in rough, uneven letters. Look again. The priest wiped the glass clean immediately and covered the mirror with a cloth. The following day, he contacted the diocesan office. According to the church archives, permission was granted for a preliminary investigation into possible spiritual oppression. Not yet an exorcism, but the case would be monitored. Meanwhile, Elena's condition continued to worsen. Without the mirror in her house, the dreams did not stop. In fact, they grew far more vivid. This time the dreams no longer took place only in her bedroom. She began seeing the church, specifically the small storage room where the mirror had been placed. In the dreams, she would walk down the narrow corridor. The door would already be open, and inside the room, she would see the mirror standing alone against the wall. Each time she approached it, the reflection showed her body lying on the floor again. But the shadow behind it was getting closer. Night after night it moved forward slightly, always just out of clear sight. Then one morning Elena woke up with something new. A thin red mark around her wrist, as if something had been gripping her tightly. She immediately went to the church to show Father Matteo. The priest examined the mark carefully. He said nothing for several seconds. Then he made a decision. Later that afternoon, 2 additional clergy members arrived from a nearby parish. Together they conducted a formal inspection of the mirror. Prayers were recited. Holy water was sprinkled across the glass. At first nothing happened. Then one of the priests leaned closer to examine the frame. That was when the mirror changed. The reflection in the glass darkened slightly. Not completely black, just dimmer, as if the light inside the room had faded. The priest studying the frame suddenly stepped back. He claimed he had seen movement inside the reflection. Movement that did not correspond with anyone in the room. All 3 priests looked into the mirror together. For several seconds, nothing unusual appeared. Then Elena, who had been standing behind them, spoke quietly. She said the reflection was wrong. The priests turned toward her. She pointed at the mirror. Inside the glass, the 3 priests were standing exactly where they should be. But Elena's reflection was not standing behind them. It was lying on the floor again. This time her reflection's eyes were open, staring directly upward, at something standing above her. The priests turned quickly. Elena was still standing behind them in reality, alive, breathing. But in the mirror, she was already dead. and the shadow figure now stood fully visible beside the body.
Tall, thin,
its face completely obscured by darkness. One of the priests immediately covered the mirror again. The room filled with the sound of rapid prayer. Father Matteo later wrote that the temperature inside the room dropped sharply at that moment. The glass beneath the cloth began vibrating against the wall. A slow, trembling sound, as if something inside the mirror were trying to move. Within hours, the diocese approved a formal exorcism procedure. Not of a person, but of the object. The ritual was scheduled to take place the following night inside the church. Elena insisted on being present. The priests initially refused, but she argued that whatever was connected to the mirror seemed to be connected to her as well. Reluctantly, they allowed her to remain in the chapel during the rite. The mirror was placed upright at the center of the room. Candles surrounded it. The cloth was removed. At first, the reflection showed only the empty chapel. Father Matteo began the exorcism prayers. Minutes passed. Then the knocking began again. Not from the wall this time. From inside the mirror itself. 3 slow knocks. The glass trembled, and the reflection inside the mirror began to change. Because now, standing in the reflection behind the priests, was the tall shadow figure, watching them. And this time, it was smiling,